Have you ever heard of the day the United States hanged 38 men at once? It wasn't a hidden atrocity. It wasn't buried in some classified file. It happened out in the open, in the heart of a small Minnesota town, the day after Christmas in 1862. A wooden scaffold stretched wide across a square. A crowd of thousands, settlers, soldiers, children, ministers, gathered as if for a holiday spectacle. The air was bitter and still. You could see the white of breath in the cold morning light. A signal was given, a white flag dropped, and in an instant, the trap fell. 38 Dakota men were hanged together, their bodies swinging above the snow as cheers rose from the crowd below. It remains the largest mass execution in U.S. history. But how many Americans today can name it? How many of us have ever been taught why it happened, or what it meant? This wasn't just a moment of wartime justice. It wasn't about one single act of violence. It was the culmination of years of betrayal, starvation, political greed, and a nation's deliberate choice to crush a people who stood in the way of expansion. It's a story wrapped in silence, hidden in footnotes, brushed aside to protect the image of a country that calls itself free. But the truth has weight. It doesn't disappear just because textbooks decide to ignore it. The Dakota 38 were men with names, families, songs, languages, and history. They weren't villains in the way the nation's narrative painted them. And they weren't savages. They were witnesses to a system that broke every promise it made. And they were made into an example, a warning to others who might resist. So how did this happen? How did the same president who signed the Emancipation Proclamation also sign the order to execute 38 Dakota men? What chain of events led to that cold December morning? And why has this story, which should be central to the American narrative, been almost completely erased from our shared memory? To answer those questions, we have to return to the beginning, to land, to treaties, to hunger, and to a war that was less about bloodlust than it was about survival. Before the executions, before the headlines, before the gallows, there was a river valley. For countless generations, the Dakota, specifically the Eastern Dakota, or Santee Sioux, lived along the Minnesota River. Their world was a living rhythm. The rivers were highways, the prairies were their sustenance, the forests gave shelter. Their societies were structured around kinship, reciprocity, shared responsibility. Elders guided decisions, councils maintained balance, and every season carried meaning. But by the early 1800s, this world was under pressure. American expansion moved steadily westward, driven by manifest destiny, the belief that white settlers were destined to take the continent. Land was the key, and the Dakota held land the government and settlers wanted. In 1851, the Dakota were forced to sign the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux and the Treaty of Mendota. In those treaties, they ceded around 24 million acres of their land. In return, they were promised small reservation lands, annual annuity payments of money and food, and protection. But those promises were written in English, on paper, by men who never intended to keep them. Within years, the Dakota were confined to a narrow strip of land along the river, while white settlers claimed the fertile prairies. As the population of settlers grew, game became scarce, hunting grounds were fenced off, and the Dakota way of life was strangled. Then came the traders. These men controlled the distribution of food and annuity payments. They made loans to Dakota families at outrageous rates, ensuring a cycle of permanent debt. When the government delayed payments, sometimes for months, sometimes for over a year, The Dakota were left with nothing. By the early 1860s, they were living on the brink of starvation. The summer of 1862 was particularly brutal. Crops failed. Wild game had been nearly hunted out by settlers. The promised annuity payments were once again late. Dakota families came to the agencies to beg for food. Instead, they were mocked. A trader named Andrew Myrick made a statement that would become infamous. If they are hungry, let them eat grass or their own dung. That wasn't just cruelty, it was contempt, a deliberate public humiliation meant to remind the Dakota of their powerlessness. Meanwhile, warehouses full of food sat locked behind doors, controlled by traders and government agents. Children starved, while supplies rotted in storage. Every day that passed tightened the noose around the Dakota. They were desperate, not because of some natural disaster, but because the U.S. government and its agents engineered their desperation. This was not a sudden war. This was a slow, grinding violence. Treaties broken, promises ignored, dignity stripped. In this atmosphere of hunger and rage, a single spark would set off an explosion. The spark came on August 17, 1862. A small group of young Dakota men were out near Acton Township. Hungry, desperate, and carrying the weight of months of humiliation, they encountered a settler family. Words turned sharp, then deadly. 5 settlers were killed. It was a small incident, isolated in place and time, but everyone knew what it meant. The Dakota leadership gathered that night. The council was tense. For years, they had petitioned for food, for payments, for justice. For years, they had been ignored. Now, with blood spilled, they knew the U.S. response would be swift and unforgiving. Some argued for surrender. Others argued for war. Taoyataduta, known to the settlers as Little Crow, had once advocated for peace. He had traveled to Washington, seen the power of the U.S. firsthand, and understood the futility of open war. But even he had watched his people starve. When the younger warriors called for action, when they said they could no longer watch their children die, Little Crow stood before them and said, "Braves, you are little children. You are fools. You will die like rabbits when the hungry wolves hunt them in the hard moon. Taoyataduta is not a coward. He will die with you." In the early morning of August 18th, Dakota warriors launched a coordinated attack on the Lower Sioux Agency. Andrew Myrick, the trader who mocked their hunger, was killed, and his mouth was stuffed with grass. The symbolism was clear. From there, the fighting spread quickly. Settlements were attacked. Fort Ridgely was targeted. Panic swept through the Minnesota River Valley. Settlers fled by the thousands, spreading stories that grew more exaggerated with every retelling. The press labeled it a massacre. Politicians called for the Dakotas' extermination. Militia units mobilized. And while some Dakota warriors fought to drive back the settlers, others acted to protect civilians or sought to surrender. The war lasted just over a month, but its intensity burned like a wildfire. The U.S. Army, even while stretched thin by the Civil War, moved decisively. Fort Ridgely held. New Ulm resisted. The tide turned quickly. By late September, Little Crow and many warriors had fled west. Hundreds of Dakota, including many non-combatants, were captured or surrendered. The war was over almost as fast as it had begun. But in Washington and in Minnesota, the decision had already been made. The response would not be measured. It would be brutal. What followed was not justice. It was retribution. Colonel Henry Sibley, who had led the U.S. response, established a military commission to try the captured Dakota. The process was a mockery of law. There were no defense attorneys. There were no witnesses for the defense. Many of the accused didn't even understand the charges because no proper interpreters were provided. Some thought they were simply giving testimony to prove their innocence. Instead, their words were twisted into confessions. The commission, composed of Sibley's own officers, rushed through case after case. Some trials lasted less than 5 minutes. Men were condemned for simply being present during battles. Others were accused of killing civilians with no evidence beyond hearsay. By the end, 303 Dakota men were sentenced to death. 303. To the settlers and politicians in Minnesota, it wasn't enough. Newspapers demanded that every Dakota prisoner be executed. The governor warned President Lincoln that if he didn't approve the executions, vigilantes might. Lincoln was in the middle of the Civil War, trying to hold the nation together. He was known for his measured decisions, but he was also under immense pressure. He ordered 2 lawyers to review the cases and separate those accused of killing civilians from those who fought in battle. The review was hasty, full of mistranslations and gaps, but in the end, Lincoln commuted the sentences of 265 men and approved the execution of 39. It was a political calculation. He wanted to appear merciful while still satisfying the public's thirst for blood. One man's sentence was later commuted at the last minute, leaving 38 to die. The Dakota, who had surrendered in good faith, believing they would be treated justly, found themselves condemned. There was no mercy for those who had resisted, and in truth, there was no real mercy for anyone. The stage was being set for something far more chilling. On December 26, 1862, in Mankato, Minnesota, the largest mass execution in U.S. history took place. It was a public event. A massive wooden gallows had been built, a single structure designed to hang 38 men at once. Crowds poured into town. Wagons filled the streets. Children were hoisted on shoulders. Some people came out of curiosity. Others came for vengeance. Soldiers in Union blue lined the perimeter, rifles gleaming in the pale winter light. The Dakota men were brought out 2 by 2, singing their death songs. They greeted each other as brothers, many embracing for the last time. Witnesses described the sound of their voices, haunting, steady, defiant. Ministers prayed aloud. Officials made speeches. It was treated like a ceremony, a show of state power. At the appointed moment, a white flag was dropped as the signal. The trap gave way. 38 bodies fell together. Some in the crowd cheered. Newspapers the next day reported the event as justice served. Souvenir hunters cut pieces of the rope. Doctors and grave robbers later desecrated the bodies, taking them for study or display. Among the executed were warriors, translators, leaders, and men who had helped settlers. But to the state, they were all the same. Dakota. Their deaths were meant as a warning, a demonstration that resistance would be met not with negotiation, but with annihilation. President Abraham Lincoln, celebrated as the great emancipator, had signed off on their deaths just days before the Emancipation Proclamation was set to take effect. In one moment, the country was declaring freedom for some while publicly destroying others. And the memory of that contradiction was buried as quickly as the bodies of the men who died that day. The violence did not end on the gallows. It continued quietly, systematically for years. Dakota families, women, children, elders, those who had not fought, were rounded up and forced into internment camps. The most infamous was at Fort Snelling, a place that became a site of immense suffering. In the winter of 1862 to 1863, thousands of Dakota were confined in a wooden stockade beneath the bluff. They had little shelter from the bitter cold. Food was scarce. Disease spread quickly. Hundreds died there. In early 1863, Congress passed legislation expelling the Dakota from Minnesota entirely. All treaties were declared null. Their land was seized. A bounty was placed on any Dakota who remained in the state. Little Crow, who had fled, was hunted down the following year and killed. His scalp was displayed publicly as a trophy. Survivors were marched west to reservations in Dakota Territory and Nebraska, places chosen not because they were livable, but because they were far away. Over time, the story of the war and the execution was rewritten. Schoolbooks told it as a tale of savage attack and noble defense. Settlers were cast as victims, the Dakota as villains. The starvation, the broken treaties, the political decisions, all of it was erased. For over a century, the Dakota 38 existed mostly in whispers, but memory has a way of surviving where history books fail. In 2005, a group of riders began what would become an annual tradition, the Dakota 38 Memorial Ride. Every December, they journey on horseback from South Dakota to Mankato, retracing the path of their ancestors. Along the way, they stop in towns, tell the story, speak the names of the men who were executed. It is a ride of remembrance, resilience, and reclamation. It is a reminder that history isn't just written in books. It lives in the voices of those who refuse to let it be forgotten. The story of the Dakota 38 is not just a story about the past, it's a mirror held up to the nation. It shows how power decides what to remember and what to bury. It reveals that the story of America isn't just one of liberty and opportunity. It's also one of hunger, betrayal, and calculated violence. When we tell the story of Abraham Lincoln, we talk about the Emancipation Proclamation, but we rarely talk about the 38 Dakota men he condemned to death. We talk about the Civil War, but we rarely talk about the war waged against indigenous nations at the very same time. This silence isn't accidental. It's a choice. But silence can be broken. Stories can be reclaimed. And when they are, they reshape the way we understand the country we live in. The Dakota 38s were not nameless enemies. They were fathers, brothers, sons, leaders. Their deaths were meant to erase a people's place on their land, but their memory endures. It lives in ceremony, in oral history, in the quiet strength of communities that refused to disappear. This story matters not because it is comfortable, but because it is true. And truth, even when buried, has a way of surfacing. What other stories have been silenced like this one? What other truths lie beneath the surface of the history we think we know? What did you think about today's video? Comment your thoughts and suggestions for my next video below.